We're going to hear about tiny forests tonight. I think a lot of us have probably read an article or heard about this one way or another. So Joe Chambers, he's a registered landscape architect with 30 years of experience in urban landscape and architectural design. He's worked extensively on large-scale master planning and built landscape projects. He's taught at Penn State and Rutgers, where he researched and wrote about landscape construction and the work of Frederick Law Olmsted, whom I think most of us know. Let's see, Joe, he's the leader of the MKSK Lab for Climate and Biodiversity Resilience. And then Andrew Putnam is here from Cambridge, Massachusetts, all the way. He's a certified arborist and superintendent of urban forestry and landscapes for Cambridge, Massachusetts Public Works. He's been responsible for implementing the majority of the Urban Forestry Master Plan.
Thanks very much, Jill, and thanks everyone for having me. I saw a lot of familiar faces on the little tiny windows of the Zoom call. So I'm Joe Chambers. I'm a landscape architect in DC, although I am originally a Marylander from Frederick. And I've been here working in the district for about 15 years. With a company was called Landscape Architecture Bureau, Lab, but we recently merged with another bigger company called MKSK. We tell people just think Mi Casa, Su Casa. We do a lot of work on site-specific stuff, schools and parks and things like that. We did a lot of the work on the wharf. And if you are in and around DC or Bethesda or Arlington, you've probably used one of our spaces before. So this is our larger company at our yearly event in Ohio. We didn't used to do that much planning work, although I had a lot of urban design background. So now we're merged with a group that has a much bigger set of resources, and that's exciting stuff. They've made me the head of the Climate and Biodiversity Resilience Lab, and we're building a bunch of new initiatives. And I'm going to talk about one of those tonight, and it has to do with mini forests. So here is the map of DC, a slide that I use quite a bit because I speak with a lot of DC people. Two really interesting images. On the left, you see a map that was created by the Media Lab at MIT with one green pixel for each street tree in the District of Columbia. You can see how in Rock Creek and things, there's a sort of a blank space because it isn't really street trees in there. And you can see the outline of the Anacostia and Potomac rivers. Interesting map. I mean, what's great about street trees is that they spread green as an infrastructure all over the city, which means that there's a reasonably fair distribution of greenery that gets to everybody. Interesting, though, how dark the aggregation of dots turns as you get up into Northwest. That is roughly the fall line between coastal plain and the Piedmont, and is more or less the division between the flatter, older, less well-served, let's say, portions of the community of Washington, D.C., mostly because before there was air conditioning, people could move off to the sweet-smelling, breezy hills of places like Tenleytown and buy themselves a bigger house on a wider street that had more street trees on it, and the street trees survived for longer. So basically a geographic, social, and plant community division there between two places. Interesting map. On the right, we see the SWAP map for Washington, D.C., State Wildlife Action Plan map from a few years ago. This was spearheaded by Damian Ossie, who probably a lot of you know at DOEE. Really interesting SWAP map because this is the only really full-on urban one in the country. And this is an overlay map that includes things like hydrology, soil types, density vegetation, deer browse. There were a whole bunch of maps that they overlaid and came up with this gradation between strongest habitats and weakest habitats, let's say. So as you get into the few blue spots and then into the green, you're at the richest habitats in the city, and the red are the weakest. So interesting how these places that were saved because they were stream valleys or steep hills or things like that ended up being the places that are now protected by city government and are our parks and so forth, and how the aggregation of buildings in the downtown. So we're very interested in this idea of how do you take the benefits and the greenery that you see on the left-hand side and pull those across all of those pieces of the city that block the movement and so forth of different species from place to place. So we think a lot about habitat value of different places, especially urban places. What we see here in this grassy space in the middle of this intersection is what we call a wonder-bred landscape in our office because it doesn't have that much nutritional value. And you have a lot of these sprinkled all over cities. Lawn is a great thing where you need it, but unfortunately it's sort of like the the sort of go-to landscape for large agencies and things like that. Not so much because it's cheap, because it isn't that cheap to take care of lawn, and not because it isn't carbon efficient, because it definitely is not, but mostly because it's very predictable. You give somebody a mower, you point them in a direction, and they mow until they're done. And there isn't an awful lot of management or control or anything. What we're all about is trying to take these landscapes and make them into much richer, more biodiverse places, and try to up all of those co-values that we know, those co-benefits, health, stormwater retention and delay of runoff, cleaning of pollutants, all of that sort of thing, health of the citizens and so forth, take those and make them more widespread. So ideas like, here we have just a quick sketch looking at this. Now in this square here, you have some complicated conditions. You've got an underpass here and another one there, right? So you have some landscapes that you kind of can't touch. And you also have these views, like when you come to the end of Pennsylvania Avenue, you see over across the Anacostia Valley, and that seems like something that's worth preserving. So we just did this quick overlay to say, what if in all these orange areas you put meadow, which would up the carbon value of this entire, all of these areas by about ×4, right? And then in all these other areas, you're planting forests. So, and that's what we're working on, is we're coming up with a kit of parts with about 20 different options where cities can go through and fill in all their blank spaces and push and goose all of their open space into being more productive land. In other words, let's get into the carbon farming and human health farming and habitat farming business across our cities. And we're starting a campaign of sorts, calling this 50 by 50. Let's get to 50% canopy cover by 2050, so that as we go into these darkest decades of the climate crisis, we actually are making our cities cooler and more livable. Okay, so really quick, going back to some of the basics, the carbon cycle. So before there was industry and so forth, there were 3 carbon cycles running in the world. One between the atmosphere and the surface of the earth, one between the atmosphere and the all of the living material on the surface of the earth, and one between the atmosphere and the ocean. And the ocean, well, the earth itself actually is massive, but it's deeply enough buried that the exchange between the atmosphere and bedrock and so forth is rather small. The ocean's exchange is enormous because of the heavy surface, the high surface area, but the volume of the living material brings it up pretty close, even though the terrestrial, the land part of the Earth is only less than a third. So first one is this geological cycle. What happens is that carbon comes out of the atmosphere and it bonds with rock as the rock weathers. Little pieces of that powdered, in the form of soil mostly, run off and go into rivers, goes down into the ocean where it falls to the bottom. And then eventually through subduction, the plates at the bottom of the ocean slide under the land plates that are a little bit lighter. And that ends up coming up in, sort of geysers and volcanoes and things like that. And this cycle was in balance consistently for, certainly in the state that we found it 200 years ago, was in balance for about 10,000 years since the age of the end of the Ice Age. But it tends to put itself back in balance. It's like a big thermostat for the Earth. Okay, same is true of the living material. The amount of carbon that's pulled in by photosynthesis into living tissue goes back out in terms of decomposition of material, fire, respiration, and things like that, and also through soil respiration. And those two things tend to sort of stay in balance for years and years. Same was true of the ocean. The ocean surface pulling in quite a bit of carbon because of biological activity and also just sort of chemical bonding on the surface of the ocean tended to also stay in balance with the amount of carbon that was respired by the plants and animals of the ocean and so forth. So what's happened since then is that we have cut down about a third of all the forests in the world, which is bad because there was a lot of carbon stored in that living material. And we started about 200 years ago burning fossil fuels and putting that up into the atmosphere. For a long, long time, a slight imbalance in the ocean's ability to absorb. The ocean had the ability to absorb because of the increased amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that has slowly acidified the ocean over years. In the meantime, this amount has gone up from, nothing to about 40 billion tons of carbon per year. And that's about where we are. And basically the UN is saying, let's cut that in half by 2030. And then let's get that down to 0 by 2050. So the interesting thing is that we look at it, there's this ongoing acidification and then now deep sea acidification. That's a new topic of research. But the interesting thing is the amount of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is up by about 1,000 billion tons from what it was pre-industrial. And that represents about how much is in the carbon that's been cut down in all the living tissue around the world. Now, we're not going to destroy all of our cities and get rid of all of our farmland. But it is interesting to note that every little corner, every piece of land that we can turn back into woods or prairie or whatever kind of more productive natural landscape is going to contribute to our overall comfort in terms of cooling the air and also help to bring down climate change. So I always talk to people about population. You have what we call the hockey stick graph, where we go for about 200,000 years. And then around 1800, for the first time, we hit 1 billion people in the world. Since that time, a little over 200 years, we've gone from 1 billion to 8 billion people. So we're on that exponential rise that you often see among species that are very successful. We're just a very, very successful species. Interestingly enough, that's now starting to decline. The rapid rise that we saw through the 60s, 70s, and 80s is starting to turn down and is expected to level out by about late part of the 2000s going into about 21. And that's largely because of better public health and women's education. Because when families know that they can take care of their kids and that they're not going to die, they don't have so many kids. That's why in the wealthier parts of the world, like in the US and Europe, our birth rates are now going down. So this is the challenge. Here we are at about 40 gigatons per year. We want to get by this time, 2030, get down to half of that, and then down to 0 by 2050. This right here represents an additional more than 600 billion tons of carbon up into the atmosphere, which is, it's not going to quite double, but it's going to close to double the amount that's up there already just in the next 25 years. So as I tell people, this is the pants on fire emergency that we have to address as soon as possible. Okay, so this is just going into with agriculture spreading. Originally, a couple of thousand years ago, was just dots in a few places. You get up into modern day, and actually the farmed parts of the world are predominant, and there are only pieces of land which is left in forest. About a third of all of the forest has been cut down. A lot of that is in cropland and a little bit of in grazing land. But cities are on the upswing. We're less than 0.25% for over 1,000 years, have swung up to about 1%, headed on up towards 3% in the next few decades, and are expected to top out at about 5%. So rural populations have stopped growing. Urban populations are absorbing all of the growth in population that's happening now. So the land itself, just a tiny little slice of it is actually urban, but the population, 80% of the population is all stuffed into that little 3%. So managing our cities is very important. I will get to the mini forest part, sorry. Fragmentation is one of the big problems with the growth of cities. As cities grow up, they make these, they grow out in little tendrils and leave tiny little pieces. Those pieces are, they leave wildlife stranded between islands of natural landscape. And managing this configuration is actually very important. When you break up blocks of vegetation with things like roads, you decrease the amount of interior habitat, which is inhabited by a very particular group of species. You make more edge, and edge species are great too, but there's just an awful lot of edge out there and not a lot of center. So it's something to keep in mind, that the more collected landscapes are, the better. Planting that and other natural features that bridge from one large group to another large group can be passages or corridors that allow species to move from one to another. So again, in managing the configuration and the size of our natural spaces, that is one way to actually increase. So it's a form of efficiency to plan those out. Okay, here's the really terrible news. The population of birds in North America is sharply on the decline. Cornell Lab of Ornithology found that about 30% of the birds disappeared between 1970 and I believe it was 2010. So in about 40 years, we lost 30% of our birds. Heavily in the grasslands, not in the wetlands. The wetlands actually had an increase, and I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that that's because of the Water Protection Acts from the 1970s. It's been a benefit. It just shows that if we actually do the legislation that protects wildlands, that there's actually an increase in habitat and living wildlife in those places. And then the worst of the worst news is that insects are on the decline, somewhere between probably closer to 1% and 2% per year. And as we all know, insects do it all. They tunnel and create porosity in the soil. They have their own little worlds. They're pollinators, they're decomposers, they do everything. They are the little things that run the world. So with them in decline, that's a really serious threat to us. And here are in blue the insect population decline, and in red, the bird population decline, mapped against the human increase. And you can see how as our star rises, their star is falling. And this is something that we really have to do something about right away. Just to give you a sense of proportion, about more than 80% of the biomass in the world is in plants, and a good almost 13% is in bacteria. And that leaves us with the fungi and all the animals and all the other microorganisms in one little, less than 5% slice here in the middle. And just looking at the animals really quick, really it's the all of the marine animals that are the biggest populations. The fish and the mollusks and things like that are up here on the top. We're down in here towards the bottom, even though we're up to more than 8 billion people. But it's interesting to note that the number of poultry animals, so ducks and chickens and geese and things, are about 3 times in population the number of wild birds in the world. And the number of livestock, so cattle and goats and sheep and things, are about 15 times the number of wild mammals in the world. So just to give you a sense of how out of balance those animal populations in the world are. Okay, we like to talk about how important it is to get plant material, living material, into cities because of the importance of health. I'll move through this really quickly, but there's wonderful work that's been done on healthy microbiomes. So in case you didn't know, you are a walking ecosystem. If you took a census of all the cells in your body, the you cells would lose out by a little bit to the cells that aren't you, which are mostly bacteria and a few other different microorganisms. Now, these are small compared to your own cells. So they occupy about 5 to 10% of your body weight, and most of those are in your gut. But it's just interesting to note that wherever you go, you take this little ecosystem with you. And just like any other ecosystem, there are certain native plants, native species that live in your body. And those develop as you grow from basically a sterile existence in utero through the birth canal and breast milk and so forth, growing this microbiome through your life, and it's constantly changing. Now, there's a lot of work to talk about how you need to be more dirty to develop a healthy microbiome. There is truth in that. A lot of really great work that's been done in Finland. Let me go back for just a second. Looking at the influence of microbiomes on people's health generally. Your skin is the big way that your body learns about new microbes that it hasn't encountered before, because your skin is just outside of you all over. It's it's the largest organ in your body, and your lungs and your gut, which are the other 2 big interfaces with microbes, are pretty climate controlled, pretty moisture controlled. And they're really good at eliminating microbes that are a problem. So your skin is the place where you learn about other things. If you don't get experience through your skin with microbes that you haven't encountered before, your immune system doesn't learn how to regulate, and it starts to turn against itself. So in urban areas around the world, as we solve a lot of our, we cure a lot of our traditional diseases, we have TB and mumps and measles here, all on the decline. We've got things like asthma, type 1 diabetes, and MS, all on the rise. These are all autoimmune diseases that come from your immune system attacking your own cells. And that just comes from the amount of time that we spend outdoors. The average American spends 93% of all of their time indoors or in a vehicle, 7% of their time outdoors. And you think about that includes farmers and ditch diggers and people who for their work spend a lot of hours out of doors. So the average person is actually spending quite a bit less. In the island of Manhattan, the island itself is a little less than 60 square kilometers, but the amount of indoor built space is actually about 3 times bigger. So interesting how built our environment is. And a lot of these microbiomes come from either the soil or the leaves of plants and things. And every species of plant has its own microbiome. So if you want variety, go outside where the plant variety is, and that's where your body's going to find it. And we've started to look at building spaces where every person, say in this building that's on H Street, this is where the Whole Foods is on H Street, is within 2 flights of being in an outdoor space where they can sit and enjoy and so forth. And that's one of those spaces there on the back terrace. So this is where we get to the mini forest part. We're talking about 2 of the tools in our kit for increasing biomass in cities overall. I showed you in orange in that one of those first slides, meadows. Meadows are great because they have deep-rooted plants. They have a tremendous diversity because it's a very competitive field of action here. Meadows are essentially blankets of soil. Usually they're pretty thin, and they have limiting factors that keep trees from growing so that the grasses and the forbs are the ones that really grow up and dominate. Here we have an alpine forest, and this is, long winter and windy and, lots and lots of runoff that carries soil away. So this is a very thin-soiled, landscape that fights the soil, and the trees just don't grow here that well. Here we have a coastal meadow. Here, I think that's actually a lot of heather and so forth, which is a woody, and that sort of half counts, I guess, as meadow. But again, here's the factor. It's the wind and the salt spray and things like that that limit and keep the trees from growing there. And that's the thing that really distinguishes a meadow is this limiting factor. Okay, prairies are a particularly interesting one because you're talking about an area that has deep soil, and it's really the rainfall and the perk rates in the soil of all this loess that blows off of the Rocky Mountains and has blanketed everything from Colorado out into Illinois and Indiana. So in those conditions, what you get are grasses and forbs that have, some of them grow high, some of them not so much, but they have incredibly deep roots. The carbon sequestration capacity for plants like this in the soil is off the charts. It's the most carbon sequestering landscape. And so we're starting to experiment with ways that we can use deep-rooted forbs and grasses and things to take advantage of this. Cities can be a tough place to grow a meadow. The thing is that how do you create artificially a limiting condition, like a salt spray or something like this? These urban meadows still support wildlife and pollinators and things like this, but the look of a meadow that we know from our part of the world really comes originally from Europe, and especially from England. This is meadow was a sort of a lightly grazed agricultural space, a livestock grazed space and everything. Now, to keep that grass down, the grasses and the forbs, you have to manage it with mowing, and the mowing has to be done at a very, very particular time so that you preclude some seeds from spreading and include others. And it still takes quite a bit of weeding and overseeding and things like that, but still very powerful for biodiversity and for retention of runoff and good health and things like that generally. Okay, the mini forests. So here's the hero of this story, Akira Miyawaki, the Japanese horticulturalist who spearheaded the discovery of mini forests. He really developed this technique and worked on it for his entire life, a remarkable feat. He was very interested in these traditional Japanese temple forests with their mature canopies and so forth. And so what he did was he looked for a way that he could reproduce that in much tougher conditions. How do you make a rich forest in a place that's degraded or has less than perfect conditions for moisture, for rainfall and so forth? So what he came up with is kind of incredible. He came up with this idea of doing reforestation work, but instead of digging a hole for each tree, he said, let's just dig the whole bed. So if you have an acre forest that you're going to plant, let's just till an entire acre, and let's till it down about 3 to 4 feet in depth and mix it in with lots and lots and lots of compost. And let's not plant whips on like 3-foot centers. Let's plant seedlings on 18-inch centers. So this is incredibly dense forest planted at about 30 to 40,000 about 30,000 stems per acre. So incredibly dense planting. And this is a mix of native shrubs, understory trees, mid-canopy and upper canopy trees, so that there's a sort of a layering. And then you plant these things and you just water them like crazy. The thing is that with so much competition with other plants, these plants have nowhere to go but down, and their roots just go deep, deep, deep into this cultivated soil. And because a lot of moisture is captured down there, and there's so much nutrient that's been supplied there, they grow 4 and 5 feet per year, and on very close spacing. There's quite a bit of attrition through the competition between plants and so forth. But it amazes me that it works, but it does seem to work. The forest is so thick and grows in so quickly that it requires no maintenance after 2 years. The carbon sequestration, we've run some numbers, is off the charts, 3 and 4 times as much as normal reforestation efforts. Interesting thing is that it can have a very tiny footprint. Its edges are very shallow because it's so dense, which means that you can have a mini forest that's as small as about 800 square feet, about the size of 4 parking spaces, which means that you can put one just about any place. And it's very flexible when you have something that small. All of the green infrastructure values, the amount of wildlife that it attracts, the phytoremediation, the cooling, the stormwater absorption, all multiple times more than normal reforestation efforts. This is a practice that's used for things like windbreaks, prevents dune migration. I've heard of people using it as a storm surge block against tsunamis because the planting is so dense that it actually withstands storm surges and things like this. I'm really interested in things like, since no plants can compete and grow on the floor of this forest, could be used to sort of dam up linear landscapes like along the sides of roadways and become sort of a fire break to stop the spread of invasives, right? So if you we're talking about Japanese stiltgrass earlier, growing along a roadway, could you get ahead of that, start one of these, and in 2 years, the stiltgrass can't really spread because there's a couple of 100 feet or more of forest that no competition on the forest floor. So a lot of interesting uses. Even the tiny pieces, because they're so dense, will sustain interior species from much like a much larger forest would. Okay, so they look sort of a hot, wet mess when they're first getting started because of all this crazy competition. You have to plan for any paths or open spaces that you're going to have in them and so forth. Really interesting thing is because we're talking about so many seedlings and so much planting, about the only really cost-effective way that you can do this is to have a public planting day. But this is a really great thing. And I'm sure that Andrew will be able to talk about this some more.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. I will dive into our experience planting Miyawaki forests, but I will just do a little background on how the city of Cambridge came to start planting them. This is a photo of the first one we planted at Danahy Park. This is a 4,000 square foot Miyawaki forest that I'll get into more detail about as we go on. So again, I'll just go through our Urban Forestry Master Plan, the recommendations from that, and then the start of our first Miyawaki and the subsequent ones as well. So the Urban Forestry Master Plan, in brief, was started in 2018 in the city of Cambridge. It was a task force that was compiled of 18 residents or institutions or group representatives of the city of Cambridge, put together, meeting over the course of a year, meeting 12 times, working with a consultant and many experts in different areas, put together roughly 1,000-page document that became our Urban Forestry Master Plan, and was broken up into 3 sections, which documented the current state of the forest, risks to our urban forests, and set targets and prioritizations and our action steps. This is a screenshot from a document we produced at a 30-page for residents in Cambridge to summarize that 1,000-page report into something a little more digestible. The main takeaways from the master plan, this is that report as well, is that the canopy coverage, just like in Joe's slide of Washington, D.C., was not equitable throughout Cambridge. Some neighborhoods had a surplus, you could say, where the average the city is going for is 30%. Some locations were as low as 13%, 12%. And so as part of that, the Urban Forestry Master Plan, the idea is, can we get equitable distribution for cool corridors and to reduce the effects of heat island to all residents within Cambridge, regardless of the landscape, the density of the houses and things like that, and cool accessibility throughout the city and things like that. So another recommendation was to start to rethink how we design parks. The Triangle Park is in a very developed and continuing to be developed section of Cambridge. It's a very hot area. There's a lot of commercial space there. And this roughly over an acres parcel was donated to the city. And originally it was going to have some programming space and some hardscapes. And using some of the action steps from the master plan, the city worked with community development and redesigned this area to replicate more of a forest grown system. And so there's an earthen berm, and we were able to get 392 trees in this area, very densely planted with sedges, and we created like a lower wetland grass area that's featured in this top right photo. And so it actually made the park space much more enjoyable and usable because of the traffic that surrounds it. These berms and dense plantings made it an almost immediate oasis and created habitat. And we have more parks coming online. Another 2-acre park that just opened, that has, the city in general is transitioned away from your typical just grass parks and trying to provide more low maintenance naturalized areas that are not maintained with mowers, but they're either hand weeded or maintained every few weeks, and then hayed for mowing and things like that to reduce the amount of maintenance they require, provide habitat for birds and different wildlife and things like that. So we're sort of completely rethinking the spaces, the edges of the parks that we use, how they're maintained, what's planted there, and that all sort of corresponds with the recommendations of the Urban Forestry Master Plan, where we can cool local areas and replicate natural forest systems and prairie systems within the city. And so this is, in Cambridge itself, space is very hard. It's very hardly fought over. It's very limited. The photo on the left here is a lot that may or may not eventually be built into something, but in the meantime, my counterpart, Ellen Coppinger, and I reclaimed this area to create somewhat of an urban meadow and some pollinator garden and naturalize this area. And the photo on the right is a redesigned park that is completely planted with flowers that, that won't require mowing, and we'll continue to hire specialists who will weed and maintain those. And these have been established for a few years now and doing great. There's a lot of activity, wildlife, and birds in these little areas that we're carving out in our green space within the city. So one of the recommendations of the Urban Forestry Master Plan was to plant over 1,000 street trees a year to begin to curb loss. And so we've planted at Public Works 1,100 trees in the last year. And we do that by having our own in-house planting crew, and we plant trees bare root. So to facilitate this large amount of plantings, we created our own bare root nursery where we hold the bare root trees and we heal them in with a decomposed wood chip and mulch blend, and then plant them throughout the city. The slide says it holds 700, but I currently have 800 down there now, so I could edit that to say 800. In terms of planting diverse and resilient species, the city plants a majority of natives. We do find in our hardiness zone, there are some challenges in getting in some of our absolute harshest growing conditions in the most densely urban and hardscape locations. For survivability, we still have a palette that includes some non-natives, but overall throughout the city, we plant a majority of native trees. This fresh pond where this golf course and this nursery is also the reservoir for the city of Cambridge, and this is all native non-varietal species that we planted there. And so we continue to try out new natives that are available to plant as street trees with some success and some not, and just implementing them in and continue to actually plant a higher percentage of natives for our street trees. Part of the ensuring that trees grow well in the urban environment is improving the soil conditions. So the city has, Public Works has an extensive compost tea program. We put out, every newly planted tree receives at least 3 treatments within its first growing season of compost tea. We put out this previous fall over 16,000 gallons of compost tea that we brew in-house, and we have 2 brewers that are running all through the fall and in the spring. All of our planting pits are, the soil is amended in place with activated biochar. And for overall success of the trees, we've enlarged our tree pits, which in Cambridge is really challenging. Sidewalks are quite narrow. They're at most 6 feet wide, and to be ADA compliant, you need at least a 4-foot wide walking area. So we've enlarged and narrowed our tree pits to 2 by 10 to be able to fit as many trees as we can along sidewalks and streets in the city. This is just ongoing community engagement with the Urban Forestry Master Plan trees in the community. We do a lot of events and things like this. The photo on the right is a flower basket that people can sign up to receive. And it's a mesh basket, and the medium inside of it is very porous. And they're grown in a greenhouse for us right now during the winter. And people, quote unquote, adopt the flower basket, and it's placed on the ground in front of the tree so that it eliminates foot traffic in front of the tree and soil and the resulting soil compaction. And the a budding owner commits to watering the tree, and the medium that these flowers are in is really porous. And so the vast majority of the water for these flowers, it permeates down into the soil and waters the tree. So the abuttor waters and gets nice, beautiful flowers, and then we get to get the trees watered, and it's been really successful. We put out like 1,200 of these last year, and so it's going well. So this is just sort of a summary of where we, the direction we're going in with growing new canopy. A lot of it was reducing risk and planting new trees. It's an ongoing process in the city, and it's a slow and steady race, but we've had some preliminary LiDAR data that shows that the trend is improving within the city of Cambridge. So now to the Miyawaki forests. The background I just provided with what we were calling at the time microforests or groves, and the amount of soil conditioning and improvements we were doing in place I was approached by a group, Biodiversity for Livable Climate in Cambridge here, and they proposed the idea of a Miyawaki forest. And after reading up on it and realizing that it dovetailed very nicely into the programs we were already doing or implementing at some scale, the city was more than happy to try it out. And so the first one that we did, this is an aerial photo of it. We had a consultant, Ethan Bryson, teach me the process so that I could continue to do it. It's over 4,000 square feet and has over 40 native species. This is the day after planting. So this is sort of the process. The traditional Miyawaki method requires almost 3 feet soil removal, but as a policy within the city, we try not to move soil around, whether it's contaminated or just the environmental impact or carbon footprint of hauling soil and hauling in new soil. And so what we ended up doing, working with the consultant, sort of thinking it through of our own experience within the city, is we removed this soil in lifts, 1 foot lifts, and amended it in place with decomposed wood chips, biochar, and compost tea. I think we put 90 yards of decomposed wood chips in here and just vast amounts of a really high quality compost that we source from an organic cranberry bog on the South Shore that provides us with the compost to do our compost tea. And so we actually tilled this into the location without having to remove anything except the sod. The soil remained in place, and we decompacted it, tilled it in the process. And we continued to treat with compost tea until the fungal count in the soil was greater density than the bacterial count, which is important for these to mimic forest conditions, but also to suppress weed growth as the Miyawaki forest gets established. The fungal count in the soil is another guiding thing we do for street tree plantings. That's why compost tea is really effective, because in the newly opened tree wells or newly planted locations, keeping the fungal count higher reduces the amount of weeding and tree well maintenance that we need to do. And so that obviously applies here because it replicates the forest conditions that the Miyawaki forest replicates. So after the first Miyawaki forest that we worked with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, it was a resounding success. We had about 80 volunteers that came to the first Miyawaki forest, and the outpouring was just amazing. My phone was ringing all the time. I mean, for all the work that we do and the amount of work it took to do this Miyawaki, it was really a pleasant surprise at how engaged the community was and very excited about it. It covers a lot of things, natives, pollinators, quote unquote, rewilding or renaturalizing urban areas and creating these oasis. And so the next fall, we went ahead and did another Miyawaki forest in a small unused park in an even denser urban area in the port of Cambridge. This was just a grass strip between an access road and a walking path. There was an art sculpture here. The artist had already heard of the original Miyawaki forest and was more than happy to work with us to relocate that to a more appropriate location in the park. And this smaller one, which is about 1,400 square feet, this will mimic more of the Miyawakis that we'll do in Cambridge moving forward. The 4,000-foot one in Danahy was sort of our one to showcase and get started, but just the space limitations in Cambridge, these 1,000 square foot to 1,400 square feet, 1,500 is more reasonable and realistic for us to find those locations. This one had over 35 species with 900 total plants. It's a wide range of just all ages, kids, everyone from the community there. And it's a pretty vibrant, lively atmosphere with everyone planting. And we're able to plant these locations in about a day. The one at Danahy, I probably would have preferred 120 volunteers, just based on the size. But the 80 that we had here at Green Rose, it was an easy day. It went great. We do a little follow-up in-house we spread some more decomposed wood chips to mulch and some more compost tea applications afterwards. This is the species list for the one at Green and Rose Park. I see Paula Phipps has commented that the location at Green and Rose it is abutting a low income a housing building in Cambridge, and there was some outreach to get the community members engaged. And so this is the long list of species. Some of this is based on availability in the nurseries. This is the sign that we've installed at the Green and Rose Miyawaki Forest for people to understand, giving thanks to Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, Ethan Bryson, who was the original consultant, Sugi, who partnered with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, and it outlines the tree species and the growth over the next 5 to 10 years. This is, before I gave a talk recently, I came and took this photo on the right, which was maybe 8 months after this fall planting, so not a full growing season, and it's completely dense and filled in. This was, it's now even doubled in height before the leaf drop that subsequent growing season. They've really taken off. The one at Danahy is, there's species in there that are easily 16, 18 feet tall now. It's very dense, and it's doing great, actually. I'm surprised even when I crawl in there and take a look at what's going on. There's just so much activity in it. In terms of after maintenance, biodiversity has worked with the city, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, to do some initial weeding to make sure that no weeds do get established. This is a really urban area where the Green and Rose one is, so it did require some weeding to get established. We put a fence up to, as you can see on the left, it's still pretty open, and to keep dog traffic and pedestrian traffic from compacting the location. The fence is up, but the fence is temporary. The one at Danahy Park, the fence is already removed. So it's just 1 to 2 growing seasons. And just to let the forest undisturbed get established, and then it creates sort of its own buffer with the edge plantings and things like that, so that we won't need a fence there, and it can be accessed by wildlife and critters and things like that. They're really popular. It's been a great success. It gets a lot of people interested in the urban forest in Cambridge and the things that the city does. And I know a lot of surrounding communities have taken it on. Abutting communities within the Metro Boston area have started it. I've provided some feedback to municipalities across the country about the process of doing it. For us, the cost, I think that's a big question, is one of the lower cost things that we do is the Miyawaki Forest. I think off the top of my head, the plant material for Green and Rose, which was 900 plants, was under $16,000, which in terms of a street tree for us, to be planted by contract is in the $1,800 mark. For us to plant it ourselves, it's $500 to $600. So to be able to plant a forest that has almost immediate impact for $16,000, we compost the wood chips. We brew the compost tea ourselves, and the compost is fairly inexpensive. I think overall it was around $20,000 to do the one at Green and Rose, and the 4,000 square foot one was slightly more expensive. And I think there are a lot of questions. That wraps it up for me. I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Joe and Andrew, for a really interesting talk. I would like to get to the questions, and I have 2. One is based on Joe's extensive background related to climate change and stuff like that. And I presume that Joe sees the tiny forest as one tool in the toolbox for dealing with climate change. And then my question for you, Andrew, is, and maybe you could answer first since you just spoke. It seems like you have a modified Miyawaki planting plan. Is that true? And have you considered that, you're not following exactly what Miyawaki planned, but that's the way things go. Things evolve and improve and whatever. So can you address that? Like what makes a Miyawaki forest or a modified Miyawaki forest based on what you all are doing in Cambridge?
Yeah, the only we maintain the minimum width of 14 feet and a minimum of 1,000 square feet, which is the recommendation. The only difference, and it's not from my reading, it's not it's not a make or break thing, but we just do everything we can to amend the soil in place as opposed to bringing in a high quality soil and removing all the soil and replacing it. So we're remediating soil in place to get it to the condition for Miyawaki planting, as opposed to potentially moving contaminated. I mean, it's a really urban area. Instead of moving contaminated soil, we have the ability and expertise to amend that in place to get it to where it's in good enough condition to plant in this method.
And so in your plantings in Cambridge, what constitutes a Miyawaki forest versus another kind of planting of plants in your,
so we've done like mini forests and groves. We've reclaimed a lot of the edges of our parks with plantings. But the Miyawaki method itself is just the overall density. I mean, the plants are really right on top of each other in the sense that they're roughly 18 inches on center apart. And it's all natives, non-varietal, and they're smaller in size when they're installed, and the extensive amount of soil prep work that goes into it and some of the aftercare. So it's the density, the overall size and width, and the species selection.
Okay, thank you. And then Joe, if you could answer my other question, and then I'll go into the background because we have a lot of other questions out there.
Yeah, we do think of this as a really important tool. It can't be used absolutely everywhere. There are site-wide, excuse me, visibility issues in cities and things like that. But where you can use it, where the density does you good, like for buffering, like Andrew was mentioning, one of the forests that help to buffer from road noise and things like that, where you can use it, if you think of making all of the greenery across the city and all of these sort of linear pieces and everything, it's sort of like you're playing a Scrabble game, right? And you're expanding out through the web of the city. The Miyawaki forest is like Q on a triple the letter score. It's like all of your co-benefits, the carbon sequestration, all of those things are multiple times what you would have with almost any other landscape use. So we see it as a really important tool if you're thinking of the planting in cities as a balm for what we're going to experience with the climate crisis. It's a really, really powerful tool. So where it can be used, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Fawn Palmer.
How long do you anticipate the Miyawaki forest to last? I mean, you're putting in climax species. So is this the kind of forest that will be there and flourishing and 100 years from now or more?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting is this sort of rocket ship growth that the forest experiences. I think it crowds itself out pretty quickly. I think of it a little bit as like sprinkling your radish seeds, but instead of picking them to thin them, attrition, just the dying of trees in that tight environment is where the thinning comes from. The thing is that they thin and eventually stabilize. You're left with a stand where everything is more or less the same age and so forth. So it takes some decades for the canopy to open up and seedlings to get started and to get that age variation represented. But I think during all of those years, essentially, if all of your co-benefits and carbon sequestration are going like this. With the Miyawaki forest, they come up like this. So your total area of benefit under the curve is huge, and they stabilize and become normal forests eventually. Andrew, you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, one of the benefits of it is that it does mimic a climax forest in the area. And so even when there is the competition going on, just like in a natural forest situation, you'll have some of the understory species hanging out, waiting for a hole in the canopy, some sunlight so that it can grow up. Our long-term maintenance plan for any forest that we do will be, if a tree is outcompeted and is dead or standing, more than likely it's going to just stay as habitat as dead and standing. If it's on the perimeter and maybe a hazard, we would put it back. We would either chip it back into the forest itself so that the carbon that's being created in this fast growth is stored back into that forest floor and creates that carbon cycle. So there is some competition. There is some, things are outcompeted, but the whole carbon cycle is ongoing there, and all of that will be left in the forest. The bigger one at Danahy it's not terribly close to walking proximity, so that will more or less be left alone. The one at Green and Rose will require just some visual inspection from our arborist to determine if there's any hazards, but for the most part, it's just going to go through the normal climatic forest cycle.
Lauren?
I have two questions, actually. One is, in tight urban spaces, are you close enough that the sidewalk heaving becomes an issue with all these tree roots? That's an issue, just sort of that level. But I'm also thinking about this in terms of, at least here in Montgomery County and all over Maryland, really, the deer situation is such that we have no baby trees in our forests, by and large, in many of our forests. Would this sort of method help regenerate forests? Because we could do these kind of tight plantings. Maybe we maybe we protect from the deer and really dense stands and get fast growth that would re-recruit the young trees. I'm just sort of thinking of it in that way. If you have any thoughts on that.
I can hop in on the sidewalk heaving is a issue within the city within the last decade. We use a sand-based structural soil for our underlayment for our sidewalk panels, for cement panels. That really reduces that heaving. And then any existing heaving, we shave down the concrete, or we use a flexi pavement and bridge over the heaving locations. There's a mix of asphalt, brick, and concrete sidewalks in the city of Cambridge. And so we have a few different options. In some locations, we've actually rebuilt the sidewalk on the street side of a tree to preserve the tree and make it ADA accessible. So we do a lot of interesting stuff like that. In terms of the only real deer population is in the Fresh Pond Golf Course. That temporary fencing I have up, in theory, I know it's completely different down in the mid-Atlantic how prolific the deer are. I'm finding with natives in my own property, a little more rural, that deer are a big issue, but maybe just by the numbers and some fencing, you could help get some stuff established, and maybe wildlife would spread the seeds and things like that.
I have the same question about deer, actually, but Andrew, are you finding, the Miyawaki forests are usually fenced when they're first planted. Does that help with the deer at all? It's not tall enough fence. There is no such thing as a fence that's tall enough to keep a deer out in this part of the world. But do you think that plus the density of the planting would actually help to keep the deer from entering?
Yeah, we don't have the issue in specifically Cambridge, but the one at Danahy now is so dense you could theoretically have deer feeding on the perimeter of it, but it's hard I've gone in there a few times. It's really challenging to get inside of it at the moment. So that could work. I could also put you in contact. I know I think a group in Arlington, or maybe it was Reston that has attempted it, and I can find out their success on it just in the area that's as deer and not infested, but a lot of deer in that area.
There were other questions about, are there any local examples down here? But so we would, I think people would be really interested to hear about any local examples, you know.
Arlington County has planted a couple. I think they're experimenting more with this sort of mini clusters, you know, which is a hybrid of the idea. Basically, it's taking a dollop of mini forest and using it as a sort of almost like seeding a petri dish or something like that. You take some groupings of native plants, and they tend to provide more protection for each other, shade and et cetera and everything, so that they can then spread and take an area that's being repatriated by trees and start with that sort of good material. It's like putting sourdough starter into you know, into the pot. There are experiments. I know I saw from Biodiversity for a Living Climate, there have been some efforts out in Frederick County. I think, I know we're working on planting one in Ward 7 right now. We're getting a group together and we're going to plant one in DC in the near future.
I'm president of the board of Biodiversity Livable Climate, but I live in Tacoma Park, and I'm very active with the Community Food Forest Collective that currently has 4 projects underway, 3 on the Montgomery College campus at Tacoma Park Silver Spring. And we've only just started to map out probably 6 different planting areas, one of which is planned to be a Miyawaki forest. We also have plans working with Ben Fritton at the Reed Center, which is out just west of Middletown, Maryland. He's got a 158 acre site, 40 acres of which he's planning into sort of permaculture. One of those test plots that we'll be doing probably next spring will be a Miyawaki forest, doing comparison with probably 6 other replicate kinds of plantings to make comparisons. And we may try a hybrid Miyawaki food forest project as well.
Can you talk about maintenance with this? I know that with Miyawaki, there's a connection to community groups to maintain spaces, but it seems to me that public spaces will eventually end up under the control of public maintenance crews who, oh boy, you know, they blow leaves into rain gardens, they mow things down, they weed whack everything, they do volcano mulches around trees. Like, how are we going to deal with that?
I can say that fortunately the city of Cambridge has 9 certified arborists on staff, and the contracts that we put out for these, whether they're rain gardens or naturalized areas, are like, we have horticultural specialists come in. So we're fortunate, and most of the maintenance is Biodiversity for Livable Climate organized volunteers to do that preliminary weeding. I coordinated one in-house at the one at Green and Rose. But it's going to be left to its own devices. And so that we did a couple overdressings of decomposed wood chips and compost tea. But we don't plan on vigorous maintenance of the Miyawaki forest really at all. The whole point for us is to just let them do their own thing.
Yeah, and our thinking about that is that, you know, anything that you can take off the table for maintenance and have it be, you know, good, strong habitat, you know, in a self-sustaining landscape, you know, that's attractive to private developers even, you know, to university campuses, hospitals and things like that. We're working on a contract for decarbonizing all estate facilities in Maryland with a group called Bauman. And that's part of our pitch to the state is that if they have a site that has a facility and then just a whole bunch of lawn, we can sop up a whole bunch of carbon by replacing the lawn with something like mini forest, depending on the conditions and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, the not maintenance is a big selling point. The savings for an institutional property would be more than the value of the carbon offset. It's potentially a big deal.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Go ahead, Margaret.
There's a recently planted foragers forest on the Fairfax campus of George Mason University, just planted last November. And this was someone's master's project or something like that.
This is Melissa Gilday. I'm here with my husband, Michael.
Thank you.
I'm an urban forester in Arlington County. So we have 3 plantings that we've done there. And I guess, you're calling them cluster plantings. One was intended to be a Miyawaki forest but it was planted with a little bit larger material. The most recent one that we did was actually, we did soil profile rebuilding. So a similar method to what you did, except that we didn't, we used Virginia Tech research for soil profile rebuilding. We did it on the site of where we had a bathroom wash away and a basketball court wash away during a flood. Wow. And we had some donated money during COVID, and it was a volunteer project. We used a much, I would say there's multiple different kinds of models for Miyawaki forests, and the Indian model, actually, the one they use in India, actually has more forbs in it. And we went more with that model. So the trees are further apart. It's 4,000 square feet. And we planted it in 3 layers, 300 tree seedlings, 300 perennials from our native plant nursery. And then we overseeded it with a perennial mix. And it's doing absolutely fantastic with absolutely no maintenance. It's 2 years and 3 years in. And but my question is, how do you deal with the attrition? What's your maintenance, especially in urban areas, from the attrition, the natural attrition, as these trees start to drop out? What's your maintenance plan for that?
We'll leave them standing for habitat. If they pose a hazard, they'll either be put on the ground inside the forest to just contribute to the carbon cycle, or if it's not feasible to do that, we will chip the debris back into the forest floor. So just contributing to that carbon cycle.
How about Catherine?
Thank you. This is very interesting. I love those ideas, but I wonder if you could comment on the issues of cost versus fairness. Imagine you mentioned $60,000 for a small pilot, and I imagine I'm in a typical low budget little city, and there is a lot of lawn out there. And where do I put my $16,000? Do I put them all in one mini forest, or do I spread it out so that more people have access to trees and shrubs and all, especially considering the fact that you're going to lose a lot of them to attrition? So I feel like, Cambridge is a very wealthy area. So like, I'm a little troubled by this view. So I still want it. I want one of those mini forests right next to me. But could you comment about those issues? And maybe I have to add one more thing. You just mentioned one interesting idea, which is to make mini clusters and distribute them fairly. But we don't really know if they are as useful as the mini forest. We don't know how they behave really. So I just, please comment on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I can, I don't know about the mini clusters per se, but the Miyawaki method for the city of Cambridge is fairly it's one of the lower cost things we do. It wasn't 60,000. The plant material was 16,000, and compared to the amount of trees that we're planting in our sidewalks and the prep work that goes into that. I've discussed it with other communities, and you know, I know Cambridge is really affluent and we have a lot of money for this kind of stuff, but on volunteer basis and things like that, it's a really affordable, and I think it's more of a bang for your buck in terms of providing cooling and carbon sequestration rapidly.
We're working on some municipal plans now, proposals for municipal plans. I think a lot of cities would like what Cambridge has. Like I'm wishing Washington, D.C. Were as progressive and had all of the programs going that Cambridge has got. The thing though is that you've got to organize, you know, the municipal level is a great place to organize for things like this. It's like, if you ask for a tree, it's sort of like, you know, if you owe the bank $10,000, the bank kind of owns you, you know. If, you know, you owe the bank $10 million, you kind of own the bank, right? It's like, you know, you ask to plant a few trees and it's like, you got to get in line and everything. You come with a group of people and the backing of your city and you ask to plant 20,000 trees. There's funding for that because people know, they recognize it as a project and everything. So I think a lot of this has to do with organizing and going at it with a certain sort of mass and energy. As far as it goes with the clusters are sort of, it's almost like halfway between just letting land lie fallow and having, you know, whatever woody seedlings grow up in it happen, which is one way of you know, approaching reforestation, is just neglect, for lack of a better word. The mini clusters goes halfway to planting a native forest. What you're doing is you're seeding a field with bits of good forest planting. You're making clusters where the duff can build up, you know, the material on the forest floor, build up some of that healthy soil microbiome and get the seeds started from a healthy center. So it's a little bit like, it's sort of like starting sourdough bread, you know, or starting yogurt, put a little yogurt in there and it spreads. But it's a hybrid between just, you know, letting things lie and actually doing active reforestation.
Jimmy Rogers.
One thing that I think is very notable about this method that is different from most new plantings I see is that design, in terms of like which plants go where, didn't really come up in the conversation. And I understand that that's probably intrinsic to the style, but I was curious if there are, whether or not it's design or whether it's considerations of species in specific locations, whether there are species that are explicitly trying to be included, excluded. If there's, I mean, maybe there's just a lot of complexity there, but I'm just curious if there's any kind of rules of thumb that would be helpful in thinking about this kind of technique.
So the orientation of the species are exposure, like southern facing is a big factor for some of the lower long-term growing, you know, sun tolerant species, and then staggered with the climate. There is a layout that we lay out, and then the volunteers randomly plant those. So it is still mixed, but we just sort of think of south facing, north facing, and the stages from a pioneer forest to a succession forest to a climax forest. So there's a lot of thought to it, but it's it's more enjoyable in the sense that we lay the few in quadrants, and then kids and volunteers, they just grab them, dunk them in compost tea, and then just put them where they can fill them in. So it's really random. We try to steer it a little bit, but it's definitely much more organic and replicates that natural process more.
Maria Baranano.
My question was about these tiny forests in the long term, to look at this thing in the long term. Are they ever going to grow into old growth forests? Because they don't seem to have the elements of an old growth forest where, you know, a log falls down, big trees fall down and they rot, and it becomes a lot of woody material at the bottom, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think that the Miyawaki method actually jumps to that well, you can't really say old growth, I guess, if it's not established on its own. But it's like an engineered way of getting there faster, because you're starting with all climax species, and you do have, from the logs that fall in the forest, you do have a lot of attrition on a lot of fallen logs. The thing is that until you get to where you have that variety and differentiation by size and age, that takes quite some time.
Thank y'all for your presentations. I live in Greenbelt, Maryland, and I recently became the volunteer caretaker of 8 acres. And it's a invasives overtaken parcel. And my question is similar to the one right before mine. How can we apply this to an established woodland that lacks an understory and has been taken over by all these invasives? It seems like a very sun-dependent method. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think this method specifically would be pretty challenging because the amount of soil excavation that you're doing would damage most of the existing roots of the tree. So this is for sort of fallow or unclaimed areas, but not a method for the one that I have experience doing that wouldn't be applicable under trees as an understory thing.
Yeah, good question though, Chris. And actually probably the best thing for that type of area is to block out the deer.
Yep.
You know, since they're the major part of the problem. All right, thank you so much, Chris. Next, Phil, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I would highly recommend this book, Mini Forest Revolution by Hannah Lewis, who at the time was working for Biodiversity Renewable Climate. There's a key diagram in here which shows the natural evolution of a forest taking 150 to 200 years to reach maturity, and then the telescoping of time that occurs by planting. The species mix of the climax forest can be shortened that period to 50 to 60 years. I also put a comment in. One of the key features of planting a Miyawaki forest is the impact it has on your community, the social capital, by drawing people out of their homes and apartments, creating ceremony around the planting, having a planting day, intergenerational. It also transforms your relationship to nature. It gives people something to do that affects the climate. It's very small scale, but it's a wonderful story to weave together the diversity of people, the diversity of species, creating habitat, actually getting your hands in the dirt and feeling like you're contributing to something, and then to watch it, the accelerated growth and what happens over time. So it's really transformative.
Thank you, Philip. What's level of science is going on in studying these tiny forests? Because these are kind of a big deal. It's a novel thing, and they need to be really researched. There's a lot of sort of research, but maybe I don't know how much serious research is going on that gets published, and they're probably so new, maybe that hasn't been possible yet. Can you answer that?
I'm really interested in that. I've been looking and haven't been seeing that much. I mean, what I'm really looking for are field testing that looks at wildlife populations. I'm looking at studies where they take thermometers and they're looking at change in temperature, over a period of years. Looking at profiles of how many trees survive, what the attrition rate and how many survive, how quickly they grow, and things like that. There isn't that much out there that I've seen. There's a lot of really good feeling. Now, the thing is that I think, Miyawaki started planting these, especially around Toyota plants, in some of them in Indiana and places around the Midwest, and a lot of them in Japan. So there are a lot of older forests that are out there, but I'm not seeing a lot of study looking at that. I'm starting to dig through. Miyawaki and Box wrote together. This British horticulturalist teamed with Miyawaki, and they wrote a book about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I'm starting to go through the bibliography, but not seeing that many recent articles and things.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I haven't seen much either, but I haven't looked that hard. What about you, Andrew? Because you mentioned.
No, I haven't been able to find any. So it's just something I'm keeping an eye out for.
You mentioned when we first talked, you mentioned somebody you knew who was doing some research.
There's some data collection at the one at Danahy from Lesley University, but about invertebrate density at the forest, but it's still in early collections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that's something that would be really helpful to look into. What are these tiny forests really, really doing? Because it's a cool idea, but you know, we all need scientific information. So
yeah, this would be a great project for like the National Arboretum or the Morton or the Missouri Botanic Garden or places like that, New York Botanic Garden.
Thank you very much to our speakers who have been patient and held out for questions beyond the limit that we usually set. We appreciate that. I think I'll close it down then. Thank you all so much. All right, thank you very much, Andrew from Cambridge, Massachusetts. You guys did a great job, really stimulating, and we're probably all going to go out and plant one of these in the next year. Okay,
Thanks.
good night,
Thanks
everyone.
for having me.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming and being part of this.